On the morning of July 20th, 1973, a phone rang in Hong Kong, and the man who answered it would remember that call for the rest of his life. Bruce Lee was dead, 32 years old. The fastest fists in the world had gone still. The man who taught millions that the body could be a weapon of discipline, not violence, was lying in a hospital bed, and no one, not his doctors, not his family, not the tabloids already sharpening their pens, could agree on why. Was it a drug reaction? A hidden illness? Sabotage? A curse that would later reach into his own son's life? For 50 years, that question has refused to die. And somehow, more than half a century later, Bruce Lee is not fading into history. He is expanding into it. A California governor recently signed his name into law. The United States Postal Service put his flying kick on a stamp. A major new biopic is already generating buzz before a single frame has been shown to the public. The man died at 32, yet the legend keeps growing larger every single year. Why? To understand that, we have to go back to the beginning, to a hospital in San Francisco's Chinatown, to a childhood in war-torn Hong Kong, and to a boy who was, by his own family's account, too restless, too proud, and too quick with his fists for the world he was born into. This is the story of Bruce Lee, not just the icon on the poster, but the man underneath the myth. Bruce Lee was born in November 1940, inside San Francisco's Chinese hospital, while his father was on tour with a Cantonese opera troupe. Weeks later, the family sailed back across the Pacific, and Bruce grew up not in America, but in the crowded, chaotic streets of Hong Kong under British colonial rule. It was a childhood shaped by two very different worlds pulling at him from opposite directions, one Chinese, one Western, and that tension would define almost everything he did afterward. As a child, he was already performing. He appeared in Hong Kong films before he could even read fluently, cast again and again because the camera seemed drawn to him. But off camera, a different story was unfolding. Hong Kong in the 1950s was rough, and young Bruce found himself constantly in street fights, constantly being challenged, constantly needing to prove something. His parents, worried he might get seriously hurt, or worse, enrolled him in Wing Chun Kung Fu training under a teacher named Ip Man. Few people watching those early lessons could have guessed they were witnessing the seed of a global martial arts revolution. At the time, it was simply a parent's attempt to keep a stubborn teenager out of trouble. That stubbornness eventually became too much for Hong Kong to contain. After a serious street confrontation, his family made a decision that would change everything. They sent him back to the country of his birth, alone, at 18 years old, with very little money and no guaranteed future. In May of 1959, Bruce Lee returned to San Francisco, the city where he happened to be born, to start over completely, thousands of miles from everything familiar. He eventually settled in Seattle, working odd jobs, teaching Kung Fu on the side, and enrolling at the University of Washington to study philosophy. This detail surprises a lot of people. The man famous for lightning punches spent his days reading Western philosophers and Chinese classical texts side by side, obsessively cross-referencing ideas about mind, movement, and self-control. He wasn't just training his body. He was building an entire worldview, one that would eventually reshape how the world understood martial arts altogether. It was in America that Bruce Lee began to clash with tradition. He started teaching martial arts openly to non-Chinese students, at a time when many traditional teachers in the Chinese community strongly objected to sharing these techniques outside their own culture. Some accounts describe him being challenged to a serious sparring match over exactly this issue. Whether that particular fight unfolded exactly the way legend describes it is still debated by historians, but what's not disputed is the outcome. Lee walked away troubled that the fight had taken longer and left him more exhausted than his training seemed to promise. So he did what almost no one else in the martial arts world was doing at the time. He started tearing his own system apart. He rejected the idea that any single rigid style held all the answers. Instead, he began developing his own approach, absorbing what was useful, discarding what was rigid, adapting constantly. He would eventually call this philosophy Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. It wasn't just a fighting style. It was a rebellion against dogma itself, born from a man who refused to be boxed into anyone else's tradition, including his own. And that refusal to fit into a box is exactly what almost kept him out of Hollywood entirely. By the mid-1960s, Lee's martial arts skill had caught real attention in the United States. He demonstrated at a major karate tournament in California that became something of a legend in itself, reportedly amazing audiences with strikes too fast for the naked eye to properly track. That exposure led to his first major American television role, as Kato in The Green Hornet. He moved with astonishing precision on screen, and audiences noticed immediately that this was not ordinary fight choreography. But here's the part of the story that too often gets left out of the highlight reel. Hollywood, at the time, was not ready to embrace an Asian leading man. Lee reportedly pitched a television concept about a wandering martial artist in the American West, an idea that many believe was eventually developed into the show Kung Fu, but with the lead role given to a non-Asian actor instead. Whether Lee's original concept was directly used or simply echoed similar ideas already circulating in the industry remains disputed to this day, and Lee himself expressed frustration about being passed over. What is verified is the broader pattern. Doors kept closing for him in America, not because of his talent, but seemingly because of his race. Most performers, faced with that kind of rejection, would have given up or settled for smaller supporting roles forever. Bruce Lee did something almost no one expected. He turned around, went back to Hong Kong, and decided to become a star on his own terms, in an industry that hadn't rejected him yet. That decision changed the course of Asian cinema forever. In Hong Kong, Lee starred in The Big Boss, then Fist of Fury, then The Way of the Dragon, a run of films that shattered box office records across Asia one after another. Audiences had never seen fight sequences choreographed with this level of speed, precision, and raw physical intensity. He wasn't just performing martial arts for the camera. He was redefining what on-screen combat could look like, frame by frame, blow by blow. Fist of Fury, in particular, struck a nerve far beyond entertainment. The film's story, set during a period of foreign occupation, showed a Chinese martial artist standing up against outside oppressors who mocked and belittled Chinese people. For audiences across Asia still carrying memories of colonial humiliation, this wasn't just an action movie. It was catharsis. Bruce Lee became something bigger than a movie star. He became a symbol of cultural pride, reclaimed on screen. By the early 1970s, Bruce Lee wasn't just famous in Hong Kong. He was arguably the single biggest movie star in all of Asia. And Hollywood, the same industry that had quietly closed doors on him years earlier, suddenly wanted him back. This time on his terms. Warner Brothers partnered with a Hong Kong studio to produce Enter the Dragon, a film specifically designed to launch Bruce Lee as an international leading man, crossing over from Asian markets straight into mainstream American theaters. It was meant to be the culmination of everything he had fought for since he was a teenager sent alone across the ocean. Finally, total validation, on a global stage, exactly as he had always insisted it should happen. He never got to see it released. On July 20th, 1973, just 6 days before Enter the Dragon was set to premiere in the United States, Bruce Lee was found unresponsive in Hong Kong at the apartment of actress Betty Ting Pei. He had reportedly complained of a headache and was given a prescription painkiller. He lay down to rest. He never woke up. The official cause of death, according to medical examiners, was cerebral edema, swelling of the brain, believed at the time to have been triggered by a hypersensitivity reaction to a compound found in the painkiller he had taken. That conclusion was formally accepted by the coroner's inquest. But formally accepted is not the same as universally believed, and in the decades since, this single detail has fueled endless speculation. Some pointed to a serious cannabis-related medical episode Lee had reportedly suffered months earlier, wondering if his body had some underlying vulnerability no one had properly diagnosed. Others, feeding off rumors swirling through Hong Kong's tabloid press at the time, floated far darker theories, feuds with rival groups in the film industry, jealousy, even claims involving the criminal underworld. None of these more dramatic theories have ever been substantiated by credible evidence. But the fact that a man this powerful, this disciplined, this seemingly invincible could simply die in his sleep at 32 was, for millions of grieving fans, almost impossible to accept as a simple medical accident. And then, 20 years later, tragedy struck the Lee family again. in a way that felt, to a shaken public, disturbingly familiar. In 1993, Bruce Lee's son, Brandon Lee, was killed on the set of the film The Crow, after a prop firearm that should have fired only a blank charge instead discharged with a piece of a dummy bullet that had lodged in the barrel during an earlier scene. He was 28 years old. The eerie parallel, a Lee man, dying young, on the edge of a major career breakthrough, under circumstances that seem to defy easy explanation, is a huge part of why the phrase "the curse of Bruce Lee" became embedded in pop culture. It is important to be clear here. There is no scientific or factual basis linking these two deaths beyond coincidence and grief. But the emotional weight of that coincidence has never fully left the public imagination, and even now, it resurfaces in documentaries, books, and late-night internet debates. So why, more than 50 years after his death, does Bruce Lee's story keep resurfacing, not shrinking, but growing? Part of the answer is representation. Long before it was a mainstream conversation in Hollywood, Bruce Lee was already fighting, quite literally, against the reduction of Asian characters to servants, villains, or comic relief. He insisted that Asian characters and Asian actors be shown as capable, dignified, and central to the story. Decades later, as conversations about representation in film have only intensified, his career reads less like nostalgia and more like prophecy. That's part of why, in recent years, formal recognition of his legacy has only accelerated. In 2026, California's governor signed legislation making Bruce Lee the first Chinese American in the state's history to be honored with his own official day, marking May 17th, the date an 18-year-old Lee first stepped back onto American soil in San Francisco. His daughter, Shannon Lee, who now leads the Bruce Lee Foundation, has spoken about his legacy as a bridge between cultures, a figure who gave young people confidence, gave families a chance to see themselves represented on screen, and gave athletes a philosophy of discipline that still resonates today. The United States Postal Service, that same year, issued a commemorative stamp featuring his iconic flying kick, cementing him permanently into the visual language of American cultural history. And a major new feature film exploring his life, from acclaimed director Ang Lee, is already generating significant anticipation, proof that audiences are still hungry to understand who this man really was, more than half a century after his death. But recognition, as powerful as it is, doesn't fully explain the emotional pull people still feel toward him. That comes from something more personal. Here's a detail most casual fans don't know. Bruce Lee wasn't just an actor who happened to know martial arts. He was, by nearly every account from people who trained alongside him, one of the most rigorously scientific minds ever to approach physical combat. He filled notebooks with detailed breakdowns of muscle mechanics, reaction speed, and nutrition, decades before sports science was a mainstream concept. He experimented obsessively with unconventional training methods, some of which seemed strange to onlookers at the time, but are now considered standard practice in elite athletic conditioning. He didn't just want to be strong. He wanted to understand, on a scientific level, exactly why strength worked the way it did. Another detail that surprises people: despite being one of the most physically dominant screen presences in film history, Lee was reportedly quite slender and, according to some accounts from those close to him, privately dealt with insecurities about his physique compared to Western bodybuilder ideals of the era. The image the world remembers, chiseled, explosive, seemingly untouchable, was the result of relentless, almost obsessive self-discipline, not effortless natural gift. And here is perhaps the most quietly devastating detail of all. Bruce Lee spent nearly his entire adult life trying to prove, to an industry and a country that kept underestimating him, that an Asian man could be the hero of his own story on a global stage. He achieved that. Enter the Dragon became an enormous international hit. He broke through in exactly the way he always insisted he would, and he never lived to see a single day of it. That's the wound underneath all the celebration. That's why fans still gather at his statue in Hong Kong every anniversary of his death. That's why his philosophy, not just his fighting style, but his ideas about adaptability, self-expression, and refusing to be confined by other people's expectations, continues to be quoted by athletes, entrepreneurs, and everyday people who have never thrown a single punch in their lives. So what do we actually know, and what remains uncertain after all these decades. We know Bruce Lee redefined martial arts on screen, blending physical genius with genuine philosophical depth. We know he faced real, documented barriers in Hollywood because of his race, and that he responded not with resignation, but by building his own path to stardom elsewhere. We know his death was officially attributed to a hypersensitivity reaction leading to cerebral edema, but we also know that explanation has never fully satisfied a public that watched a seemingly indestructible man vanish at the peak of his life. We know his son's tragic death 2 decades later has no proven medical or factual connection to his father's passing, despite persistent cultural mythology suggesting otherwise. And we know that, in 2026 alone, a state government, a national postal service, and a major film studio all independently decided that Bruce Lee's story still deserves to be told, honored, and re-examined. Maybe that's the real answer to why he refuses to fade. Bruce Lee wasn't only a martial artist, or only an actor, or only a philosopher. He was a man who spent his entire life refusing to be defined by anyone else's limits, and then died before he could fully define his own ending. 50+ years later, we are still trying to finish that story for him. So here's the question worth sitting with. If Bruce Lee had lived even 10 more years, what else might he have built, on screen and off it? And which version of him do you think the world remembers most? The fighter, the philosopher, or the man who simply refused to be told no?